Our cover story tonight is from the US. It's a story of its debt crisis and the developments that followed. It's a story of domestic dysfunction that is likely to have global implications. The regular tightrope walk around the debt ceiling, the possible threat of a nuclear option that the US could default on its debt and blow up the entire planet. All of that is stress that the world doesn't really need. It comes about because of the unbelievable polarization that we're now seeing in the US, and an example to all democracies as to what could happen if political rivalries go too far. Here's a special report on the latest on that particular story.
On this vote, the yeas are 63, the nays are 36. The 60-vote threshold having been achieved, the bill is passed.
The US debt ceiling bill has finally been passed. The bill was cobbled together after intensive negotiations between senior aides of US President Joe Biden and House Speaker Kevin McCarthy. The bill raises the debt ceiling and removes every scope to impose a limit until 2025. The rest of the world can now breathe a sigh of relief. A US default would have had a global impact. Now that it's not defaulting, let's instead look at the highlights of the deal.
I want to commend Speaker McCarthy.
The agreement keeps non-defense spending flat next year, with a 1% rise in 2025. Defense spending is kept at $886 billion. As per the Congressional Budget Office, the legislation will result in $1.5 trillion in savings over a decade, which will help set aside funds for military veterans and the Internal Revenue Service. The US now awaits the bill to be signed by President Joe Biden, and that will be the end of America's debt ceiling story until January 2025. The last time the United States came this close to default was in 2011. It hammered financial markets, led to the first ever downgrade of the government's credit rating, and pushed up the nation's borrowing costs. However, with a sealed deal in place, the trouble seems to have been averted this time.
And let's now talk to Dr. John Kunkel, who's a senior economic advisor with the Economic Security Program at the United States Studies Center, and get some further insights into that. What's the latest you can tell us on this particular situation? Is it over for the moment? What do you think is going to happen next?
It looks like the senators obviously voted now and affirming the earlier vote in the House of Representatives earlier in the week. So that will mean the legislation will go to President Biden's desk to sign. So essentially that averts the near-term crisis. I mean, there are different questions as to what would have been the trigger on the 5th of June and whether, in a sense, the stark prospect of the US Treasury, if you like, running out of cash. And there are different views as to what that would have meant next Monday. But basically, with this agreement and this legislation, it means the issue has now been resolved, at least for the next 18 months. So it'll come back in some form in 2025, but that will be after obviously the election next year.
Look, I have to ask you this question. Most other countries don't go through this tightrope walk every couple of years. Debt crisis, is it going to happen? Is there going to be a default? Will the whole planet blow up because the US defaults on its debt? If you had to make any suggestions as to how there could be a more practical way of handling this, what would be your suggestion?
Well, look, it certainly puts on display the division and, if you like, the dysfunction of politics in Washington for the whole world to see. And how do we go from here? Look, it's very challenging because the substance of the issues are really around the scale of the US deficit. And that's essentially two issues. One is the what's called entitlement spending, which relates to things like medical insurance and pensions and things like that. And that's basically locked on a certain path. And no politician, in particular Republicans as well, actually are really keen to send a signal that they want to curb those entitlements. And then the other issue is, of course, taxation revenue. I mean, the United States, as a reserve currency and a global economic superpower, basically at the moment pays for about 80% of its government. Now, most countries can't operate on that basis. They might be able to run deficits for periods of time, but for it to be sustainable, they need to close that gap in some ways between the expenditure line and the tax revenue line. And look, to be honest, usually that that relies on a combination of both, of restraining expenditure and finding areas of increased taxation. The American system finds it very hard to deal with this in a very polarized political environment. There are some ideas. I think Speaker McCarthy suggested a bipartisan commission, and they commissioned people from outside the Congress and the political system to look at the issue and come up with ideas. But frankly, it's hard to see, unless the politicians are prepared to take really tough decisions and to level with people about the consequences, we're likely to stay in this cycle.
All right, Dr. Kunkel, thank you so much for joining us with that perspective.